Welcome, everyone. I'm Amanda Humphrey. I'm from Northeastern University.
I'm Amanda Haymaker. I'm from Purdue University.
Hi, everyone. Kevin Ritchie from Harvard Medical School.
Next slide, please. So we're just going to go over the agenda quickly. We're going to do a quick overview of session format today. Amanda Haymaker is going to lead us through a Phase 7 very brief orientation. Kevin Ritchie is going to go over some discussion of the Subawards delays work. We're also going to invite our working groups on templates and guidance to speak and give us some updates. Then we're going to have a discussion on invoicing frequency, talk about an upcoming event, and also talk about co-chairs update and other general announcements as well. And I will hand it, I'll go through the session format, I guess. Next slide, please. So we do have some polling questions in the slide deck today. Please feel free to ask questions using the chat box as mentioned earlier. If there are unanswered questions at the end of the session, we will follow up by email, posting those to the listserv and de-identifying the questions. So now I will hand it over to Amanda for our orientation.
Right, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, and welcome to our new members. We just wanted to provide this brief introduction to our subcommittee. We don't typically do this in a normal meeting, so those of you who come to our sessions every time maybe know all of this already, but we did want to orient all of our new members to how the subcommittee is structured and the resources available. So real briefly, this is just a list of some of the things that we do on a regular basis. One of the most well-known and most time-consuming probably things that we do is to maintain the FDP Subaward templates that are used between our member organizations. We also provide samples for a variety of other types of agreements, such as foreign or subcontracts. We have a plethora of tools and guidance related to subawards that are available on the website, and I'll talk a little bit about those more in a second. We tend to engage with the membership in these meetings or through the listservs on some hot topic discussions that might relate to subawards. We do encourage that our member institutions act in a way that reduces administrative burden when issuing subawards to each other. We may mediate disputes that come up between member institutions that relate to the usage of the templates that I mentioned. And then we do provide some outreach and training that relates to the use of our templates as well. A couple of things that we don't do, and this may be cut off, I can't tell, it's cut off on my screen, but we don't provide feedback or review specific language in a specific institution subaward agreement. We're not able to, comment on specific institution policies or legal requirements, so we can't provide that sort of feedback. We also don't resolve negotiation disputes between member organizations. So just a kind of a heads up on what we don't do. Next slide, please. So our subcommittee is structured with these basic three groups of individuals. The three of us as co-chairs are responsible for overseeing the activities that are happening within the committee, facilitating these sessions at every single meeting, and then providing various webinars and trainings or facilitating those webinars and trainings. We have a number of working groups or projects that are focused on specific topics. Some of these are ongoing, some are short term. There's a listing available on the FDP website of all of our current working groups and projects that you can reference. That is an active link, so when these slides post, it should take you right there. Members may request to join any of these groups at any time. And then our membership are, all the institutions who are part of FDP may come to a meeting but not actively engage in a working project are always invited to submit questions or provide any feedback, even if you're not a named member of one of those groups or projects. Next slide, please. So most of the information that we have some sort of responsibility over can be found on the website on the Subaward forms page. It's broken up into different sections that are listed here. We have templates and samples. The templates are the documents that should not be changed and should be used in their given form between the member institutions. And then samples are a resource and can be modified as necessary for their different usages. We have a guidance document that is a huge resource. This is very much a labor of love that has been led by a number of our hardworking participants in the working groups, and is constantly updated with all sorts of FAQs and guidance related to the templates. And then we also have a modification user guide available there. There are also a number of tools that you can find that are more supplementary in nature, such as an invoicing template. There's assessment tools and sample language available, and then a lot of supporting documentation, such as summaries of the major changes that we've made from one version to the next of our templates, and crosswalks related to those, recorded webinars of the different outreach activities we've presented, as I mentioned in a previous slide, checklists, and then lastly, there's an FDP template change request form out there on that website. This is where if you have a request for a change to a specific template that you'd like to submit, we would prefer that you fill out that change request form. It gives us all the information we might need in order to consider incorporating that change in a future version. Next slide. And then lastly, these resources are more email-based, our listservs. So we have two main lists. The first being our overarching Subaward subcommittee listserv that includes all of us, all the members who have chosen to join that listserv, and is really open for all to use. Primarily, it should be used for pulling other institutions for specific questions or situations to see maybe how they might handle something that has come up, those sorts of things. It should not be used to call out other institutions, at least by name, for bad behavior. That's not what we would like the listserv to focus on. And the co-chairs and the working group leads frequently send communications via this listserv. So you're invited to join it. There's a link there as well to go to join all the different mailing lists. You just fill out the form and you get added to the list that, that we use. And then the co-chairs have their own specific email that it goes to all three of us, the subawards@fdp.org. This is meant more for template related questions, procedural related questions, those sorts of things. If you have questions specific to activities under the subcommittee, we can also answer those at that location. Next slide. And then lastly, our meeting structure. This is very brief. Usually we have some working group or project updates that we provide. Those usually aren't in a lot of detail, but a more brief nature at these meetings. Typically the meat of every session is a discussion of some sort. There's almost always a hot topic to spend some time on, and then we will provide some announcements as well. And with that, I believe I'm going to turn it over to Kevin. Next slide.
Okay, maybe just to, you notice in the chat box, there was a question about whether the Subawards listserv is open to FDP guests. It is not, it's only open to FDP members, though I believe there's also a separate listserv for FDP guests and non-member institutions. Is that correct? And so that would also be, you could follow the same sort of link that was provided by Lillian in the chat box to get to the mailing list for FDP guests and non-member institutions. Okay, on to subaward delays. What we're talking about here, this is an example of a project in a working group that Amanda Haymaker mentioned in her orientation slide. So I'll provide a little bit of background on that. Unfortunately, we're not quite where we want to be. I'm not quite where I want to be right now when it comes to wrapping up the subaward delays project. We're essentially one FDP meeting cycle behind. So you can see on this slide a revised timeline with the May 2021 virtual meeting being the target date for completion here. You can find, for the new members that haven't attended the previous meetings, and for those that did, we did present the initial more quantitative results at previous presentations. Kathy Creedler, who originated the project out of UT Health, presented in January 2020, and I presented some more results in September 2020, which we're not going to rehash right now, but you can either go to the FDP website in the previous meetings tab to review some of that data and some of those results, or when these slides are posted, I have hyperlinks to those specific presentations right here. As background for those that are new Phase 7 members, what we did here was we surveyed the FDP community, asking quantitative and qualitative questions about their institutional subaward processes in order to gather more data on what might be causing subaward delays. And the hope is not only to define what a delay is and establish a sort of industry standard timeline when it comes to exchanging subawards, but we also wanted to see if we can improve the overall process and expedite the exchange of subawards amongst one another in our institutions. And really, this is kind of to look at, like, are we leveraging the FDP subaward amendments and templates and other tools and resources that Amanda just mentioned? Are we leveraging these to the maximum extent possible? I did want to just bring up, I heard something interesting at the plenary yesterday, and if you attended the plenary, maybe you heard Dr. Austin from NCATS. He asked the question, what is preventing incredible productivity here? And he was really referring to scientific collaborations, but not just scientific collaborations. He was also referring to policies and administrative processes. And I thought at FDP, we usually talk about how can we reduce burden? I just thought the framing, what is preventing incredible productivity? I just thought that that was a little bit more exciting of a framing than how can we reduce administrative burden. So when we look at things like the subaward delays survey, maybe we can, I don't know, I'd like to think about framing the results in an answer to that question, like what here in the subaward process or in our templates or in our tools or resources or guidance is preventing incredible productivity when it comes to exchanging subawards. And we considered the 133 responses we got to be fairly representative for the level of analysis that we're trying to do here. Next slide, please. And so here are, you know, like I said, we've presented the quantitative data with the percentages and averages. And so please consult previous presentations for that data. But now we're at the more challenging step of the qualitative data, reading business processes, sifting through suggestions and comments. And we still need to account for some new requirements and tools that have emerged since we conducted the survey. And that's where we're at right now. So my plan is to reconvene the working group shortly with the goal of completing the project and having recommendations by May 2021. Tailored to the various stakeholders in the subawards process, ranging from the individual who works on subawards on a day-to-day basis all the way up to FDP as a whole. One other note for new members, you might be hearing not just the Subaward subcommittee, but everyone at FDP advertising opportunities to get involved. The Subaward Delays survey, since we're at the tail end of the project and because it involves how we've used the FDP templates and how we're using the FDP templates, maybe not like the best opportunity for new members to get involved, but if you are interested in survey data, feel free to contact me directly. We will be reconvening the working group to go through kind of the information that we gained via Qualtrics when we pitched this survey to the community earlier last year. But regardless, for new members, any recommendations that come out of this working group will make their way into those templates, tools, and guidance documents that Amanda Haymaker just covered in her previous slides. So that concludes subaward delays. So next up, we have made great progress in subaward templates and the associated guidance documents. So I'm going to turn it over to our colleagues that have been hard at work in those particular areas to provide updates. I think we will turn it over. If we could unmute Stephanie Stone and turn it over to her to talk about template updates, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Good afternoon / morning, wherever you are, everyone. First, I wanted to say a huge thank you to Laura Register, who is taking a step back from working on the templates, but has done such incredible work over the years on the templates, and they look so different than they did even a few years ago. Anyone that's been in the FDP for a while knows the iterations that they've gone through. And at this point, we've come to such an excellent version that we really only need slight tweaks every once in a while. And a lot of that is due to Laura's efforts. She really just got very creative with the templates and made sure that we could fit the right content in and be able to get all of our compliance regulatory responsibilities in there, but do it in such a nice streamlined way, a way that would, keep the administrative burden down as much as possible, and just really took the templates to the next level. All these technological improvements that a lot of us had never heard of before were discovered because of Laura's efforts. And I know she's self-taught in that area, which is incredible. So I just really want to thank you, Laura, for, being such a good team member, always working on things quickly, coming up with new ideas, inspiring us to get together, to think outside the box, and just always being there. And we'll definitely miss you. Hopefully we'll be able to attend occasionally or participate as your new position allows. Would you be able to unmute, Laura, for some words?
Sorry, what was the last name again?
Register.
Sorry about that. I wasn't able to unmute. Thank you so much for the kind words, Stephanie. I'm on the verge of tears here a little bit. Thank you, everybody, for giving me the opportunity to come in and participate in this. And again, thank you so much for all the kind things you had to say. I appreciate that so much. Do we want to, in the interest of substantive things here, switch over to
Yes, exactly.
talking about the changes? Like I said, I'll still be programming some of the changes as they come through, and hopefully I will make my way back over one of these days back into the FDP more actively.
Yeah, so the modifications have been massively overhauled. Laura came up with this really cool new format that they've been using at Sanford. And I'm not sure how many people have been using them so far, but they're really interesting, where you have a lot of options there for what kind of action you're going to select in your modification. But if you don't select that action, then all the text is hidden. So it really makes it a clean template and very versatile for a lot of different actions. And we've also done a lot of efforts to make sure the bilateral and unilateral are a lot more consistent, with only one very stark substantive change between the two, which is that under bilateral, you can do a deobligation, but you cannot under unilateral. That type of action should only be done bilaterally. A lot of UG changes were made in both the modifications and the templates / samples. A lot of the updates had to do with citation changes, because UG added and changed some of the numbering. We've changed some of the terminology, and we've added our favorite new provision about the telecommunications ban. There will be a lot more of a detailed overview of the changes when we do the webinar in a few weeks. We've also uploaded, which Kathy might go over, various guidance documents. Laura and I worked really hard to make sure you understood all the changes, there's a crosswalk between the prior version and this version, and various guides out there for you to use these new templates. Next slide.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kathy Harlan, and my co-chair, Julie Rankus from College of Charleston. we, I guess we took over the co-chair role last year, I think it was, although time sort of has slipped away, strangely enough. Formerly, Stephanie Scott had run this committee, and there's been a tremendous amount of work that's gone into these guidance updates, and the update today is relatively brief. And Julie, please feel free to chime in if I miss anything. So we've got a new resource, as Stephanie just said. We're working on this. We've got the user guides for both the Subaward template and the modifications. The modification user guide is already posted to the website. It's located under, I think, Kevin, I'm not sure if it was moved to guidance or if it's under tools right now, but it is on the main FDP webpage, Subaward's webpage. And the Subaward user guide is going to be forthcoming. So really the purpose of this user guide is designed to really walk you through how to fill out the templates, how to fill out the forms, and which items go into which fields. There will be a separate user guide, as we mentioned, for both the Subaward and the mods. And the Subaward user guide should be coming out hopefully soon. Stephanie, thank you. She's done an initial draft and we're going to be looking at it to post shortly. Then we also are working on updated guidance to correspond to the changes in the template and the uniform guidance revisions that just came out. And the difference with the guidance from the new resource, from the user guide, is to provide more detailed explanations to questions that rise up from the membership and clarification. So it's more of an explanatory document. I think it's up to about 85 questions and a carryover guidance. With version 8, we're going to be addressing the UG changes, the revisions with the template, and we're going to discuss this in more detail, Stephanie noted, at the January 27th webinar. And we're also going to send out sometime between now and the webinar, we will send out the draft to the Subaward listserv that was previously mentioned to get any feedback before we post it as final. And we'll also share with you at that time a crosswalk that just shows what's changed from the prior FAQ version. And this document is also available on the Subaward's web page under guidance. And that's all I have. Julie, anything for the good of the cause?
No.
And just a second thank you to Laura for all her contributions to the guidance group as well. We will miss you, but we will not leave you alone.
That's true.
And that's all from guidance. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Before we jump into the invoicing frequency discussion, I just want to go to a brief discussion that was happening in the chat. And somebody asked a great question about the incorporation of new uniform guidance into modifications. And Stephanie responded in a way that I would have responded. So I'll just read this. As far as modifications to incorporate UG changes, I think it's up to the PTE how far you think you need to go in terms of incorporating those. You may think of the FDP members as lower risk, who don't have a need for detailed amendment to their subaward, perhaps a brief mention that the new UG applies. And apparently Laura has some good language and resources, as always, that she's going to share with the community. So we will make sure that we get that out to everyone. All right, so now for the more interactive part of our discussion, which is the invoicing frequency discussion. And just a reminder, please feel free to go ahead and add questions or thoughts into the chat box, and we'll try and share those routinely. But also feel free to raise your hand, and there will be opportunities for Lily to unmute you and for you to weigh in with your questions, comments, feedback. So we're going to focus our discussion on the highlighted part of the text in this slide, but I wanted to provide the whole term just for context, especially for new members that maybe don't use this template all the time and are transitioning to using it. Thought it would be helpful just to make sure everyone has seen the whole piece of language. So what we want to bring up for discussion today is the question of invoicing frequency. Invoicing is an important part of the subaward monitoring process, and frankly, for both PTEs and subrecipients, it's a part of an important management of cash flow at your institution, and also federal reporting to the feds about where you are in terms of where you've spent on your research dollars against your progress to date. So while the uniform guidance revisions did alleviate our burden around subrecipients in terms of safe harbor in reviewing some of the audits with uniform guidance, that did not obviate the need to monitor and steward individual projects and subawards appropriately, especially in terms of programmatic progress. In other words, we still have to be monitoring the progress of our subrecipients to ensure the goals of the program or grant are being met. And that obviously happens a lot through the PI to PI discussions, any scientific or programmatic reports that are made. But it does also, the financial piece does play an important component to that, because you are receiving those invoices and using the progress reports and the invoices to kind of cross-reference or validate. They said this piece of work was done. They've invoiced for this piece of work. Okay, that kind of rings true, as opposed to we've received an invoice, but we don't have any reports or the expectations aren't being met, etc. So, one of the reasons this is coming up now is recently we had some questions about how much a PTE can require a certain invoicing frequency. So what we want to do is discuss some of the complexities around invoicing to get a better picture of the spectrum of practices across our member institutions. Currently, our practice is to have a spectrum approach to the language, at least monthly, but not less frequently than quarterly. That gives a good amount of space for institutions to follow their own particular practices while setting some baseline expectations and standards for institutions in terms of their collaborations, and making sure that spending and progress are kind of aligned across the institutions. Next slide, please. So why are we discussing this? Cash management is critical to all of our institutions. Having a high accounts receivable or a high accounts payable balance is a risk. So if you're a subrecipient, you want to invoice and get those expenses paid as quickly as possible. And if you are a pass-through entity, when you get that invoice in, you want to have all the information that you need in order to process it, get that payment out the door, and then be able to draw down for that expense. Another impact for a more limited subset of awards, but still an important subset because they're usually high dollar, high visibility, is awards with restricted carryover. If an award has restricted carryover, an invoice can make or break with those prior approval requirements. If you've got that invoice in hand, even if you haven't paid it yet at the time of progress report, you can still show the government, okay, yeah, we're below the 25% threshold. We don't need to request a prior approval, or we are over the 25% threshold and we do need to request a prior approval. And then thinking of it from a compliance and subrecipient monitoring perspective, progress. If you're not receiving invoices, is work being done? If the issue isn't the timing of invoices, is it the detail of the invoices that you're receiving? Is there enough information for you to be able to assess and then pay that invoice? And then what do you see the level of obligation being in terms of layers of review? How often are you asking for backup? How often are you being asked for backup? Is it, reasonable, unreasonable? What is the burden associated with that? Next slide, please. So here's our first poll question. Please share the frequency of your invoicing when you are the subrecipient. And if you're not 100% sure, it's okay to make your best guess based on your experience. So monthly, even if it's a $0 invoice, monthly only when there are expenses, quarterly or other. And of course, please describe it in the chat if it's an other situation. And for those institutions that are new members to the FDP and you may not have used the templates, you may not have taken the spectrum approach before or thought about invoicing in this particular way, we totally understand. We still welcome your participation in talking about in general, what are your institution's business practices, even if that's not specific to subawards, institutions usually have some sort of policy on their payments coming in and going out, and when those should be posted, and expectations around invoicing. Next slide, please. All right, so the poll has closed, and I'll share the results before we move on and open the next poll. So monthly, even if it's a $0 invoice, about 10% of institutions send out a monthly invoice no matter what the number of expenses are that have posted. Monthly, when there are expenses, is a vast majority of us, 57%. Quarterly, 29%. And other is 4%. And so that is, and somebody has written a great clarification here. It's monthly if it's a $50,000 total budget or more. So maybe you use a dollar threshold. That's a great point to assess when you do monthly versus quarterly. That's great. Thank you so much. We'll move on to the second poll. So the second poll question is, share the method of your invoicing when you are the subrecipient. That we have a system that automatically generates and issues invoices via email. We generate the invoices manually and then issue them. We manually generate the invoices and physically send them out, or other. Okay. Give it another second. All right, I think we're good to close the poll, please. And so we have invoices, a system generated invoices is about 33% of the institutions generate the invoices manually and then issue them via email is 61%. So that's a majority of us. We manually generate the invoices and physically mail them is 1%. And then there's an other. And some folks are saying that they have a combination of system and manual invoices. If people are comfortable clarifying that, I would guess that would be because if you have you might have to manually generate invoices that are based on milestones, whereas you can system generate the ones that are perhaps based on budgets or cost reimbursables. All right, fantastic. Next slide, please. All right, so what we'd like to do is hear from you guys. We would love to get your input and discussion on when you're the subrecipient, what is your biggest invoicing issue? Is it bounce backs or bad email addresses? When you send those invoices to the PTE, are people mostly sending them to central mailboxes? Sometimes then you feel like you're sending it somewhere where you don't know who to follow up with if you're not getting a response. Are there issues later in the process, such as requests or excessive requests for backup? And then, are your PTEs paying your invoices timely in most cases? Is it just like an isolated incident or two where you're having to follow up on payment? So we would love to hear from folks. Is there anyone that has raised their hand to speak?
Not yet. As a reminder, everyone, if you go into the participants list, you can select the little blue hand and let us know that you'd like to make a comment. So we do have a comment in the chat, timely annual renewals of subawards to allow ongoing invoicing.
Oh, I see. So Rebecca, just to clarify and make sure that I understand your point, your point is that the renewals perhaps are not coming in timely, so you have to stop invoicing and then wait until you get the modification, set everything up, and then you're able to resume invoicing, and that whole process perhaps takes a little bit of additional time. Correct. Okay, either modification or full new awards if needed. And just one quick question, Rebecca, if you happen to be comfortable either adding this in the chat or speaking, I'm wondering, does your institution do like advance accounts when you're waiting for pending expenses, or you're just like, how are you guys managing that? Do you let the account carry over and keep running, but you're just not sending out the invoices? I'd be interested to learn more. But for now, I think Lana has a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer some of the questions that you've raised here. For us, as far as the invoicing goes for subawards, one of the issues that comes up is the need for backup, and also when we are required to prepare invoices that are not our standard templates, because we do have a great capability for the system to output a system generated invoice, but sometimes we cannot use this functionality, and we have to, you know, like what somebody mentioned, they have a combo of manual and system invoicing, and this is the example of when we have to revert to manual invoicing because we have to kick it out of our standard template and prepare it on something that is required by institution. Also, sometimes we run into issues where the sub-agreement says one thing, but the reality of getting paid is different. And we see it most often where the responsibility for paying of the invoices sits with the departments themselves rather than a central office, because we get a lot of requests for the just in case sort of backup, just in case my PI wants to know more. So we push back on those as much as we can, but it is difficult to do that because we try to defer to the agreement and the terms, and the people that we are working with are not really involved in writing those terms and agreements. And they are like, well, if you want to get paid, this is what we need from you. And then we're like, okay, well, I guess that's what we're going to have to do. So those are some of the things that we are struggling with.
Lana, this is really interesting. One question that I have about, institutions requiring you to use their template, is it usually FDP members or not FDP members?
I wouldn't be able to tell you off the top of my head without
That's
doing
fair.
some analysis.
Totally fair. That's totally fair. But I mean, it's a good point. Is there anyone else that has had a similar experience?
So Rebecca did follow up on her earlier comment. She said, correct, either modification or full new awards if needed. We let them keep running and don't send out the invoices if it's between budget periods.
I see. So some of the delay that can happen is that delay that happens when you're just waiting for that new modification to come through, giving you the authorization to go ahead and send out the invoice, getting everything set up. Okay, that makes sense.
Amanda, I can just make two comments there. The invoicing delay or the invoicing complications that result from subaward delays is one of the main drivers of conducting the survey in the first place. And so we do have some quantitative data from that, from those 133 responses as to how long it's taking to send out not just new subawards, but amendments to existing subawards. And our anecdotal evidence at the beginning was something like 90 days for both. And then the survey results were less than that, but still north of 30 days for sure. And then people what would be an acceptable timeline via a poll during the last presentation. 45 days was what was the most common result, that like if we receive the new subaward or the modification within 45 days, that's okay, and that's not going to throw a wrench in our whatever process we have in place. And then the other comment is, right, like we just said, in the FDP language says all invoices shall be submitted using subrecipient's standard invoice template. So we, the Subawards subcommittee, would want to hear if there are situations where FDP members are imposing the additional requirement that you use a certain invoice template for FDP subawards. So that'd be an example of something that the subcommittee would want to look into and try and resolve to expedite things in accordance with the terms of the subaward.
Absolutely, and I think that that's a really good point. I'm seeing some comments in the chat about some of the requirements for backup, and to go to Lana's earlier point about, if a department is challenging your payment and they're saying, well, we just want to cover ourselves and we want to get backup for X, Y, Z. I do think it is, if you are an FDP member institution working with another FDP member institution, it is within your purview to go back to the central office and say, well, wait a minute, we're perfectly happy to provide backup as needed, but this seems like an excessive, overburdensome process. Like, can we talk about it? I do think pointing that out, because sometimes the central office doesn't necessarily know how the departments are understanding backup requirements and when it is the best practice to ask for it, that can bring forth some illuminating conversations at the other institution. I think one of the other questions that somebody posed is how challenging do other institutions find having to submit invoices through an automated system. So you're the subrecipient and you have, say, 50 invoices to submit to a specific PTE, and then you have to go in and upload them to someone else's specific system. That may be less burdensome from the pass-through entity perspective to have that system in place, but is it more burdensome from the subrecipient's perspective to have to log into a system and process those invoices through there? And then Tyra has brought up that I think another contributor to invoice payment delays is that institutions are organized differently, e.g. post-award office processes invoice, pre-award issues contract. Then there's a process within post-award, whether it's manual or system generated workflows, and potentially a PI or department review and approval, sometimes yes, sometimes no. So there's a lot of different things that can be very institution specific that can be contributing factors. There's another question if the chat will be available. I think we can get a transcript of the chat, if I'm not mistaken, Lily, that we could perhaps make available, but I don't think it will show up in the recording, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. We can post any questions we don't get to or anything that comes up in the chat that we want to make sure we highlight, and we can post that on the website, but it won't be included in the recording specifically.
Okay, great. So there was I think I don't know why I can't scroll up and down on my chat right now, but there must have been a great question about working with advance payments for institutions that require cash up front. And Nate had weighed in suggesting that one option is to provide the cash advance to them, cover the amount institutionally, and receive reimbursement from the prime sponsor once the sub provides a reporting of actual expenses. And that is definitely one way to do it. Thank you for sharing that. Next slide, please. Okay, so another poll question. When you are the PTE, what is your preference for the receipt of invoices from your subrecipients? Do you want them to send it monthly, even if it's that $0 invoice? Do you only want them to send it monthly when there are expenses? Do you prefer quarterly invoicing or other? Give that a second. And I should provide the additional context that one or two of the questions that we have gotten to the subaward co-chairs is that, some institutions were looking at, well, we would like to encourage people perhaps to invoice with a particular degree of frequency. And so we just found it interesting to think about, okay, well, what are all the pieces that go into a change in expectation around frequency, and how much is that going to throw off people's institutional processes and procedures if an institution does change those kinds of expectations. So I think most people have gotten a chance to respond now, so we can close the poll. And it looks like most pass-through entities would prefer to receive monthly invoices when there are expenses. That's 67%. 14% would like to receive monthly invoices, even if it is a $0 invoice, and 19% would like to receive quarterly invoices. Next slide, please. So when you are the pass-through entity, please share your experiences with subrecipient invoices. Are you receiving them routinely? You know, even if an institution doesn't send them to you monthly, are you getting them quarterly? Are you getting them on some sort of, you know, every other month basis, et cetera? Do they meet that final the final invoice window of 60 days? Do you have issues or concerns with the costs? Are the invoices sufficiently clear to support quick processing? And that includes basic demographic information like the subaward number. I have personally received a couple that don't have subaward numbers, and it does make them a lot harder to process. And then how often do you request backup? You know, are you really focusing on your high-risk institutions? Are you doing it? I know there are a couple of institutions that ask for backup with like one invoice annually, almost like a desk audit. There are some institutions that do it just when they see particular expense categories. So I'd love to hear more about that. Julie, you don't need to raise your hand. We'll just unmute you. Julie Renkus, please unmute Julie Renkus, please. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I will say that our controller's office has specifically requested our subrecipients to invoice quarterly because we have 1.5 FTEs to deal with grant subaward invoices. And they can get rather overwhelmed when they're done on a monthly basis. So we are in that strange minority of the quarterly folks simply because we don't have the capacity to handle monthly invoicing from all of our subawards.
So I think this is a really good point to bring up capacity and to bring it up on both sides, because you know there is a significant amount of work that goes into preparing invoices, especially when, as we saw previously, a lot of institutions are still doing this process in a very manual way. It is only about a third of our institutions have systems in place that automatically send out those invoices. So there's something very real about that, not just on the generation of the invoices, but the processing side as well. And I'm not judging anyone, because I think you can still do really good subrecipient monitoring with quarterly invoices, but I'm curious to know how institutions would feel about the balance of, you know, monthly versus quarterly in the grand scope of subrecipient monitoring, and also being able to have your expenses kind of captured on hand. One concern that I've heard from some institutions is we don't get invoices from some institutions on a routine basis that we can count on. And so, you know, we're having to chase them before each progress report in order to capture what expenses maybe we can post to that progress report for the year. And so they're hesitant to say something like quarterly because they're afraid they're never going to get it in time, you know, like at least the first 6 to 9 months worth of expenses in time for that progress report. So I'm curious to know what institutions think about those two areas. Rebecca weighed in saying, our finance office wants monthly invoices with general ledger expenses to show backup for what the expenses are for. Without that backup, RPIs often feel they cannot evaluate the appropriateness of expenses to the scientific progress. And then Julie, there's a follow-up question to your comment, and someone is asking, do you stagger quarterly invoices coming to you so that your staff doesn't get overwhelmed in April, July, et cetera?
I actually do not process the invoices myself, so I'm not exactly sure what our controller's office does in terms of that, but my sense is no. I think they do the quarterly on a fiscal year basis as opposed to like a project year basis.
Okay, great. Sharon mentions we would accept quarterly invoices from an institution we have history with and a high level of comfort with. Any subs assessed as high risk must be, or as a risk, must be monthly for monitoring purposes. And that's another valuable distinction to make is where do you think about risk categorization in the context of invoicing. And then another point is the biggest concern with the 60-day window is with final invoices. They often come in much later and create challenges with closeout. So I think that's also a valuable point. And I would add to that, sometimes the more expenses that you've been able to process in advance of that final invoice, the easier it is to kind of work that invoice through the process.
Amanda, I'm seeing like a trend in these past couple comments, and maybe it'd be helpful to say something like the FDP, like by being a member institution, you're providing a lot of information to these like central repositories that kind of prove that you are lower risk, right? I'm not saying everyone in FDP is low risk. I mean, and there's unique situations, but things like participating in the expanding clearinghouse, signing off on this terms and conditions, and to use the FDP templates. We should be at a higher level of comfort, to use one of the commenters' words, when we exchange subawards with FDP members under federal awards. So there's that extra level that we can rely on each other as FDP members, and that also includes some previous comments here. Our PIs often feel they cannot evaluate the appropriateness of the expenses, without backup. So again, if FDP member institutions tend to be on the lower risk side, we're verifying that we have structures in place. We have administrative infrastructure here. We have oversight. We are all complying with federal award terms and conditions. So when we subaward to one another, there should be a heightened level of assurance there. And that's kind of the whole point of this. And then there was another comment about PI at the pass-through entity insisting that we get approval from the prime sponsor for an unbudgeted cost that's clearly allowable. So this is another thing where the FDP resources should help people. I don't want to use the terms like push back against PIs, because it shouldn't be confrontational, but should provide you with a reference as backup to look, the prime sponsor doesn't require this, and the subrecipient is within their right to rebudget up to certain thresholds. If it's good enough for the federal government, it's good enough for us. We shouldn't be adding what we call arbitrary terms and conditions at the pass-through entity level and imposing extra restrictions on FDP member subrecipients. So I hope that kind of helps a little bit in this discussion about what the FDP resources can do as far as helping you reduce burden, and then just how we consider ourselves as part of a somewhat lower risk community, because we're all signed up to do the exact same thing.
Yeah, and I think that's a really well said thought, and I think in particular it's really important to focus on our role in reducing administrative burden, and we want to find that that place where institutions are able to process invoices between member institutions with relative quickness and ease, because there are those safeguards at each institution. But there may be funny things that come up, like your general ledger may process a supply because of a certain threshold in another category, and then the other institution says, well, wait a minute, what does this category mean, or we don't understand what this expense code is. That's a good reason to ask for backup. But if it's just somebody moved a tiny bit of salary down to the supply line item and they're spending more than you thought in supplies, but they're still under the overall dollar threshold, is that really a rationale for asking for backup for every single month? And that's something that is a shift in mindset that institutions, I think, will have to work through, particularly if they're a new member. And it's definitely something where hopefully we have some good resources that address some of this in the FAQ and in the guidance document. I think we do, where we talk about invoicing and requests for backup in there as well. So I think we do have some good frameworks for helping people evaluate and look at that. And we have the RAC and the CAT as well that hopefully will continue to help foster and support our members. So we had a lot of great comments come in, including well said, Kevin, and supporting those comments. So, but Catherine mentions receiving invoices prior to the 60-day deadline is a consistent issue, particularly with projects where the PTE is required by the federal agency to provide an annual financial report. This poses a lot of problems with carryover and revised financial reports and adds more administrative time. And I think that is a really critical piece of this discussion for sure. And then Julie followed up and asked, in terms of requiring more frequent invoicing for higher risk institutions, how do you enforce this if, for example, the institution is higher risk because of a staffing or capacity issue? It's a great point. When you're working with institutions that maybe they've got one person generating those invoices, and quarterly is how they keep that person from being overwhelmed, and you come in and you ask for monthly, how is that going to change the dynamics for that particular institution, and what kind of burden does that add? And then just another great point, another challenge is refunds being received after the FFR is completed, which results in revisions. That one I think is perhaps a little bit out of scope for this discussion, but it is a valid and good point to talk about the challenge of adjustments long after that closeout period with your subrecipient and long after your federal closeout is completed. So I think next slide, please. So invoicing comes up often. So what we wanted to do is also ask for your input on what is the role of this committee. Is this something that we should be studying further? Is it worthy of a survey to find out more about practices and pain points? Is this something where we should just be reminding institutions what the terms and conditions are and be available to help talk through issues with people? What do you guys think? It's so quiet. So we've got one vote for survey, and someone has also mentioned that they like the idea of further discussion, working group survey. Okay. Oh, Melissa, good point. A good chance to collaborate with finance, audit, and costing committee. Surveys, lots of survey responses. So I think that it definitely seems like the response is that folks are interested in this topic and would like to discuss it in further detail. So I think maybe Kevin and Amanda and I are going to take the discussion and maybe talk with finance, audit, and costing, see what their interest is in this, and then maybe we can pull together some ideas and put forth some sort of proposal, whether it's a working group, as somebody mentioned, Julie, maybe that was you, an additional working group, or maybe it's some sort of collaboration with finance, audit, and costing, but definitely seems worthy of additional discussion. Next slide, please. So to let everyone know, we will be hosting, I keep messing this up. Sorry, this is my fault. Free webinar on January 27th. It's actually, I think the registration will finally, the final time is 2:30 to 4, because I think we were hoping to be able to catch more of the folks on the West Coast and maybe even Hawaii if I've done my time differences correctly. It will be 90 minutes. We will have 30 minutes of new member orientation in the templates. It's okay to send new employees of established organizations, longstanding members. Go ahead, send your new employees. That's totally fine. 30 minutes to look at the updates to the templates that Stephanie highlighted earlier today, and then 30 minutes to discuss the Human Subjects Data Attachment 7 or DTUA Attachment 7. Sign-up information will be forthcoming. The webinar will include Q&A, and we will include a place in the registration for you to send questions in advance, as well as to send them to the co-chairs in advance. And then our goal with this is actually to cut each agenda item into its own shorter YouTube video and post those online, hoping to make some more training resources available for various institutions. Next slide, please. And I will hand this over to Amanda Haymaker.
Okay, so we just want to talk a little bit in more depth about the role of the subcommittee co-chairs. And before I get into that, just the reason why we are doing this, I am planning to step off of the subcommittee as a co-chair at some point this year, so I can focus more on the proposal initiatives and expanded clearinghouse. So with that said, I'll talk a little bit about the role and then next steps to replace me on this subcommittee. So I mentioned a lot of this earlier on, but just to kind of recap, these are the primary roles of what a co-chair does for the Subaward subcommittee, facilitating these discussions like we've done today to explore different areas that we may be able to make some sort of impact to reduce administrative burden. Identifying potential demonstrations or surveys, tools, pilot projects, guidance documents. You probably got a really good feel for that in the discussion we just had. Overseeing the work group activities. We may not lead them. We may just kind of keep in touch and know what's going on, or we may be leading them depending on the specific work group. Field questions from members and non-members. There's a fair amount of traffic on the email listservs, not unmanageable, just good traffic that we do respond to. And then on occasion, and this is a rare occasion, mediating any disputes that may come up regarding the use of the Subaward templates. Those are primary roles. There's always other things that pop up or happen, but those are the types of things you might do if you would like to participate as a co-chair. We will proceed forward similar to what we did last year when we added Kevin to this subcommittee, when Stephanie stepped off and sent out an email calling for any interested individuals to submit a little bit of information about yourself so that we can put forward our recommendations as to who might fill this role. But we're all happy to answer any questions you might have before you respond, those sorts of things. But I encourage you all to think about it. It's not as much time commitment as it might seem like, really. There, definitely are busier times than others and less busy times, but it's not undoable. So with that, next slide.
And I just want to say thank you, Amanda. We're going to miss you, but I know you're going to do great work on the new proposal committee. So I think this is a really exciting opportunity.
Thank you. So I'll go ahead and do this slide since it was next. I don't know who was supposed to do it, but this is just our friendly reminders. Those of you that are new, get used to it. This slide is in every single presentation. The templates are made to make things easier. Don't change them. And then if you get one with changes, let us know and we'll contact the other institution. Next slide.
So I can do this one if you want. So this is just the COVID-19 and subawards reminder. We have sample force majeure language in the forms page. You are not required to include force majeure because we believe the additional terms on attachment 2 cover force majeure type language. So please do not rush out and modify all of your subawards. Don't add, don't feel the need to add it specifically to your template. It is just an option that if institutions as somehow have received direction or instruction that this is something that they want to look at more closely, there are some choices that we've made available there. And the options to use are FDP, foreign subaward language, general force majeure language from the FDP sample language that we've provided, or COVID-19 specific language from that same FDP sample language. Next slide, please. Contact us, please. We'd love to hear from you. So here's our Subawards email address that goes to all three of us automatically. You can email us with any sort of questions you have. If you want to know how to get involved or engaged with a working group, and maybe even if you're not sure which working group, you just want to get engaged somehow, that's totally fine. We can try and connect you with either what needs additional volunteers or support, or maybe help you understand what you're looking for and what might be the best fit for you. And I just want to say thank you to everyone, because we got a lot of really awesome feedback through the survey polls and also through the comments and the chat. And we've heard from some folks we don't usually hear from, as well as some of our consistent contributors in really helpful and constructive ways and great points. And we really appreciate it. I think that's what makes this a really fun and interesting committee to be a part of, is everyone gets a chance to participate and be part of the discussion, and you guys are really excited and engaged about it. So we really appreciate it, and thank you.